their response is always too little, too late.
In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to the Delta strain which emerged in India in October and was wreaking havoc by April, so deadly that the Prime Minister told returning Australians they'd be locked out or locked up. Delta leaked from hotel quarantine into Melbourne in early June. On the 24th of June, the Prime Minister said, "I commend Premier Berejiklian for resisting going into a full lockdown." With more than 1,000 cases today, why won't the Prime Minister accept responsibility for the consequences of his actions?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Over the course of these past 18 months, going back to the very commencement of this pandemic, when Australia moved before most other countries did, in fact almost all, Mr Speaker, where we moved to both declare the pandemic before the World Health Organisation had even done it, Mr Speaker, or that we closed our borders, we brought the country together. We put in place a system with the states and territories which saw 423,000 people arrive and some 4,200 cases kept within quarantine over that period. That's been an extraordinary job by those states and territories as we agreed at that time, Mr Speaker, to put that into place, a program very similar to what New Zealand has done, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, other countries who continue to use those mechanisms, because in a pandemic, Mr Speaker, you needed to adapt. You needed to put situations in place that enabled you to cope with what was an incredible surge. And the result of all of those efforts, the economic supports of JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, the cash flow boosts, all of these measures over many months. And the result, Mr Speaker, 30,000 lives have been saved in this country. 1 million people have got back into work, Mr Speaker. Our economy remains resilient, and importantly, Australians can now look forward with hope with the national plan that says at 70% and 80%, Mr Speaker, they will be able to live with the virus.
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order, if you can state the point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on relevance. I went to the Delta strain and the fact that it's been around since last October and the Prime Minister's comments in June.
So that's certainly had a very long preamble with a fairly, it's okay, I don't need a reinterpretation, with a very sort of open-ended question as an accusation. So I think the Prime Minister is starting to drift off onto the more general topics, but I'm listening to him.
Well, Mr Speaker, I would say quite specifically, the national plan framed by the federal government, supported by the National Cabinet, agreed, Mr Speaker, in July and in August, in the heat of the Delta strain, Mr Speaker, sets out the plan that enables Australia to live with this virus. The Leader of the Opposition makes reference, of course, to the Delta strain in India. I remember that the Leader of the Opposition was not terribly supportive of the government's moves at that time, Mr Speaker, to ensure that the Delta strain did not come through at that time. I remember the critical comments being made by members of the Labor Party of the strong stand the government took. But I'm used to that, Mr Speaker. So we will stick with the national plan. We will continue with the national plan. We will enable Australia, Mr Speaker, to go forward with confidence and with safety, and to ensure that we can live with this virus into the future.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Australians, including my electorate of Higgins, are coming forward to be vaccinated in record numbers. They want to see the implementation of the national plan so we can get past the lockdowns we've endured over the last year and a half. So, will the Prime Minister please outline to the House how this national plan, informed by world-leading scientific health and economic advice, will work to ensure we can live with COVID-19 and reopen Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Higgins for her question. I thank her for her continued advice over the course of this crisis, over these many more than 18 months. And I found her a great source of advice as we've moved through this pandemic. Mr Speaker, the national plan that the member rightly refers to gives Australians the confidence and hope, Mr Speaker, that they need to open safely at 70% and 80% vaccination rates amongst our over 16 age population, Mr Speaker, and importantly, stay open, Mr Speaker. Stay open and ensure that we live with this virus. That's what the national plan set out achieves. Mr Speaker, that plan was developed and agreed over many months, going back to early as March and February of this year. And the work that has been brought together, the best scientific, health and economic advice, is the platform and the basis for this plan, and can give Australians confidence that this can be done safely, Mr Speaker. This plan differs from many other approaches in any other country. It continues to show that Australia is making our Australian way through this COVID-19 pandemic, an Australian way that has saved 30,000 lives, Mr Speaker, and put 1 million people back into work after last year's COVID-19 recession. Mr Speaker, this plan is not about a Freedom Day. There's no special virtue in a calendar, Mr Speaker. This plan is based on vaccination rates, and it's based on a staged, careful reopening in Phase B and Phase C, Mr Speaker, at 70% and 80% vaccination rates. Nor is it an eradication strategy, Mr Speaker. It's a plan that accepts and acknowledges and understands that COVID-0 as a future plan, Mr Speaker, is not sustainable and is not realistic, as other countries are beginning also to learn, Mr Speaker. It is a plan that is clear-eyed about the risks. It is a plan that is very careful to ensure that it has the flexibility to deal with vulnerable populations, I'd say especially our Indigenous populations, to deal with the challenges and to ensure we're preparing for that time of Phase B, particularly in our public hospitals. It is also a plan that recognises that vaccinated Australians, because they present a lesser and lower health risk to themselves and their community, can be exempted from many restrictions that, Mr Speaker, that otherwise will need to apply. It's a plan, Mr Speaker, at current rates of vaccination. It means that the 70% and 80% targets that are set out in that plan are achievable this year. They are achievable when we know 335,000 doses were administered yesterday, Mr Speaker, and soon 1 in 3 Australians will be fully vaccinated. And our plan, Mr Speaker, sits along our absolute commitment that we will vaccinate children between 12 and 15, and we'll be announcing further plans on that after it's considered by the National Security Committee of Cabinet. It's a careful plan, it's a safe plan, Mr Speaker, it's the right plan for Australia.
And I call the member for Oxley.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Last year the Prime Minister said Australians needed to come out from under the doona. Now he says to Queenslanders and West Australians, we need to come out from our caves. If the Prime Minister had done his job on quarantine and vaccines, half the country wouldn't be in lockdown. Why doesn't the Prime Minister stop ridiculing Queenslanders and West Australians and accept responsibility for the health and economic crisis he helped create?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I made no such reference to Western Australians or Queenslanders. I made no such references at all. What the member opposite is saying is completely and utterly false. It's completely and utterly false.
Member for Ballarat.
Mr Speaker, they either support the plan or they don't. They either do or they don't. And if they don't support the plan, then at what rate, Mr Speaker, do they believe of vaccination that Australia should open again? So, Mr Speaker, they either support it or they don't. And it's perhaps they're having an each-way bet on it, Mr Speaker. I don't know. But what I know, Mr Speaker—
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on direct relevance, there are many things that can be relevant to this question, but it doesn't ask about alternatives. It doesn't invite commentary on the opposition. It doesn't invite him to have some argument with an imaginary friend that he's doing now.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. Certainly, the Minister for Health certainly wasn't asked about alternatives, but when the question is framed with the preamble that it has, I think the Prime Minister is entitled to respond to the accusation. I think he's entitled to do that, and I'm going to keep hearing the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was simply trying to make an explanation, to use an analogy, Mr Speaker, from a children's animated movie which I've enjoyed with my children on many occasions. It's a pretty simple story, and it basically says this, that at some point, Mr Speaker, as a nation, all of us, at some point we have to be clear that we have to move on and live with this virus. At some point, Mr Speaker, like the young female character in that movie, she decided that she wanted to go and face the future and go out there, Mr Speaker, and deal with the challenges in the world, and she brought her whole family with her, and there was a sequel to that movie, Mr Speaker, and that says something. There's a lesson in that, and that is when you embrace these things, when you prepare for the future, when you move forward, Mr Speaker. That is the encouragement that I'm giving Australians. That is the plan that we've set out, Mr Speaker. Those opposite might not share my view, but, Mr Speaker, I know that our national plan will give Australians the hope and confidence that will not only lift vaccination rates, because we need to see those vaccination rates lift in Queensland and Western Australia. We certainly need to see that. I'm sure the member would agree with me on that. We need to target those communities that aren't vaccinating as quickly as we're seeing in New South Wales and Tasmania and the AC and the T and the Northern Territory. And one of the reasons, Mr Speaker, that the national plan is so important, and that we say to those who are getting vaccinated that when you get vaccinated in Phase B and Phase C, that you will have exemptions, that you will be able to do things as vaccinated persons because you've taken the decision to ensure that you're less of a public health risk than others. The national plan, which I was explaining using those analogies, Mr Speaker, gives people that confidence. It gives them that incentive, Mr Speaker, which lifts vaccination rates and gets all Australians to where we want to be.
And I give the call to the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how rural and regional communities are playing a significant role in the Morrison-Joyce government's national plan to achieve a safe pathway out of the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question and note the work that she has been doing with her community, especially with pharmacies. Pharmacies which have become so vital in making sure we have a safe plan to take the Australian people back to their liberties, back to their freedoms, away from the frustrations that they are now dealing with, which we understand, empathise with and want to make sure that we can move as quickly on but as safely as we possibly can. Mr Speaker, we know that this job in pharmacies with Pisasali's Robinvale Pharmacies, Mildura Chemist Warehouse, Conniva Pharmacy, Guardian Pharmacy in Maryborough, all these pharmacies in the member for Malley's electorate have been vital, have been a vital componentry of being able to bring forward a vaccination rate to people in the remote and remote areas and the regional areas of our nation. I'd also like to commend the work done by the member for Cowper, who's been instrumental in driving forward this agenda, and also note the work done by a local pharmacist in his area, Judy Plunkett. And Judy was absolutely instrumental in coming forward with a plan for us so that we could add to our plan for the nation. Mr Speaker, we have in regional areas 4.6 million doses that have now been administered. First dose of nearly 3 million and second dose of 1.7 million. Even in my own area, in the hills behind Tamworth and Dangulmar, people are saying, I'm going down to get vaccinated, and they're booking into the pharmacy, they're going in, getting vaccinated and coming home. The question's asked, and I say, well, how hard was that? They said, not hard at all. You just turn up, they vaccinate you, and off you go home. With AstraZeneca, I have to admit, with AstraZeneca, was the vaccine they used. We have trials ahead of us, and we have difficulties ahead of us, and I was talking to the member for Nichols just prior to being here about the work he's doing in Shepparton to keep his community safe and to get them back to work, and also the member for Parkes, who has been absolutely at the forefront of looking after the people of Brewarrina and Walgett and Dubbo, making sure that he does the right thing to keep them safe and take them with our plan to an area where they are safer, where they are back to work. Mr Speaker, this is also the Royal Flying Doctor Service going to Eromanga, Junda, Swears Island, Kununurra, Walpiri, Pepperminati. These are making sure that we go to the edges of our nation, this vast continent. And in this vast continent, we are going to every corner to look after the Australian people, to get them to the other side of this pandemic, to give them back their liberties, give them back their freedoms, deal with their frustrations and hand them back the Australia that they were born to.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Today, Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk has announced that construction has begun on a fit-for-purpose quarantine facility at Wellcamp Airport in Toowoomba, one that will be up and running before the end of the year. No less a document than the Constitution tells us that quarantine is a Commonwealth responsibility. Isn't the only reason that Queensland has been forced to go it alone is because the Prime Minister wouldn't do his job?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No.
The member for Indi has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Minister, in 3 weeks' time, on 17th of September, residential aged care workers cannot work unless they've had a vaccination. In my electorate, government data shows that 1 in 3 aged care facilities have had less than 50% of their staff vaccinated. This is alarming. Residential aged care workers were meant to be at the front of the queue. Regional aged care services already struggle to find enough staff. We're heading towards a catastrophe. How will you fix this before the 17th of September so our regional aged care residents can be safe and cared for?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Indi. In fact, there's been extraordinary progress with the vaccination program in our residential aged care facilities, both for our residents and our workers. For our workers, the figure is now 76.9% of workers, which is a consistent figure across the country, and it's this process that we are seeing. Right now, these programs are in place across the country, and they include general practice access, state clinic access, Commonwealth vaccination clinic access, specialist hubs, and then in particular what we also have is in-reach access. And at this point in time we have 1,000 on-site self-vaccination clinics which are either completed or underway. We have 670 self-vaccination clinics which are involving providers, and I have used the example of TLC, led by Lou Pascuzzi in Victoria, which has been a national leader on that front. We've had over 585 Commonwealth in-reach clinics to residential aged care facilities, and all of these are ongoing. And that could be by GPs, that could be by Commonwealth clinics, or over 2,255 worker vaccination clinics. These programs are continuing, and I went through this only yesterday with Operation COVID Shield and with Lieutenant General Fruin, and their advice is very clear, that they believe that they will be in a position to make sure that even though all workers have already had, through the General National Programs access, that there will be specific access, and that they are confident that we will be able to ensure that every worker who seeks to be vaccinated is, and as we've seen only yesterday, we saw a near 5% jump in that rate in one day, and so we're continuing to see very high take-up. I do want to thank these workers. They have helped save lives and protect lives right through the pandemic. So, on the one hand, we now have a 76.9% residential worker vaccination rate for aged care. We also have a rate amongst the actual residents themselves, which is now at 88.6%. And so that is continuing to grow. Even though it's at an extraordinarily high level, it's continuing to grow. And one of the things that's doing that is we're going back and back again to families or to residents where they're in a position to make a decision for themselves, to encourage them, to provide information, to support them. And these two things are working together to protect residents right around Australia, and it explains the difference in outcomes between the terrible, catastrophic tragedies and loss of life that we saw in Victoria last year, and the vastly different situation amongst residential aged care facilities in New South Wales. So together, saving lives.
And I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. With over $311 billion in direct economic and health support already committed and a rapid vaccination rollout underway, will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government is ensuring our economy remains resilient and ready to bounce back when living with COVID becomes a reality? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for Fisher for his question, acknowledge his experience as a builder and as a barrister before coming to this place, and as a strong advocate for small businesses across the electorate of Fisher, and indeed for the $600 million support package for Queensland businesses that we have provided in partnership with the Queensland Government. Now, Mr Speaker, everyone in this House is aware of the real challenges the Australian economy, indeed the Australian community, is facing right now. Businesses are closed, kids are not at school, and families are apart. And recognising those challenges, the Morrison government is providing an unprecedented amount of health and economic support, including income support for those who have lost hours of work of up to $750 a week, business support across every state and territory, 50-50 partnerships with those state and territory governments in partnership with the federal government to ensure that small and medium-sized businesses get the assistance that they need. And this is helping to build the resilience of the Australian economy, an economy that has seen 1 million jobs being created since May last year, an economy that has seen the unemployment rate fall to 4.6%, a 12-year low. And I can inform the House that today business investment numbers came out for the June quarter, and they showed that business investment was up by 4.4%, Mr Speaker, 4.4%. And importantly, non-mining investment was up by 6% and is now up 15% for the year, the strongest growth in non-mining investment in more than 13 years, Mr Speaker, more than 13 years, as programs like our immediate expensing initiatives are helping to incentivise businesses, even during these challenging times, to invest. Farmers buying new harvesters, new forklifts for new factories, Mr Speaker, and like the Kenworth trucking business that I visited in Bayswater and the member for Deacon's electorate, strongly supported by the member for Wright, where they have 1,300 staff producing Australian-made Kenworth trucks, Mr Speaker. And they've taken on nearly 300 new staff in just the last 12 months alone. And they have 160 separate suppliers employing another 10,000 people. And the immediate expensing provisions, our business investment incentives, are producing real results for our economy. But we must stick to the plan, and the plan agreed by National Cabinet at 70% and 80% vaccination rates will see our economy open up and more jobs be created.
And I give the call to the member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How many hospitals in New South Wales are unable to accept ambulances carrying COVID patients because they are stretched beyond capacity? How many COVID patients are being forced to take long journeys in ambulances from Western Sydney to the North Shore? 18 months after the pandemic began and almost a year after the Delta strain emerged, why has the Morrison-Joyce government left Western Sydney so vulnerable?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Minister of Health may wish to add to that answer. The specifics of those matters, Mr Speaker, will refer to the New South Wales Government. If we can provide a specific response to those matters, then of course we will, Mr Speaker. But what I will note is that the federal government, through the National Health Reform Agreement, has ensured that funding for New South Wales hospitals has grown from $4.3 billion in 2012-13 to $8 billion in 2019-20, and that's an increase of some 86%. An 86% increase in the funding support that is coming from the federal government that is going into New South Wales hospitals. And under the new National Health Reform Agreement, the Australian government will provide $41.2 billion between 2021 and 24-25 for New South Wales public hospitals. In the most recent financial year, in 2019-20, the Australian government made a $1.1 billion funding contribution to New South Wales for the health and hospital costs through the National Partnership on COVID-19 response. So in direct response to the COVID threat, right across New South Wales hospitals. We have already put in $1.1 billion to support them in that effort. In 2021 and 21-22, we estimate a further $1.4 billion going in to support the New South Wales health system and the New South Wales hospitals. In March of last year, we established the Private Hospitals Guarantee, and in New South Wales right now, private hospitals have already provided more than 300 nurses to support the New South Wales public health response, and they have also made 19 private hospitals available to the New South Wales response. I'd be grateful if the member could convey that to her constituents of the significant support being provided to New South Wales hospitals right across the state and specifically in Western Sydney as well. Minister for Health.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and to add to the Prime Minister's answer, one of the things that we prepared for right from the outset was for the strengthening of the hospital system across the country. We increased the ventilator capacity to 7,500. In New South Wales, that's approximately 2,000. At this point in time, New South Wales has 44 patients, I understand, on ventilation. I'd need to check whether that number has changed in the update today. In particular, as the Prime Minister said, probably the most fundamental thing, apart from building the ventilator capacity, providing surge workforce capacity, bringing workforce back in, adding workforce training, was creating the Private Hospitals Guarantee. And that guarantee was to make sure that we had a national partnership where those workers are available to assist the public health system. That's exactly what's happening now. As the Prime Minister said, 19 hospitals, 300 workers already available, many more available.
And I call the member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please outline to the House how Australian Defence Force personnel are continuing to bring Australians and Australian visa holders back from Afghanistan?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question and for the commitment that he has to many veterans and serving members of the ADF who live in his electorate of Ryan. Gallipoli Barracks at Enoggera, of course, comes within his electorate, and he's a regular visitor and a great supporter of the defence personnel that work and live on that base. Mr Speaker, as Australians are witnessing, the security situation in Afghanistan is dire and it's deteriorating. That's certainly been the story of the last 24 hours. The positive of the last 24 hours is that working in particular with the New Zealand and UK partners, our friends, our cousins and the United States, we have evacuated approximately 4,000 people in total now on 29 flights since last Wednesday, 1,200 just in the last 24 hours. I want to say thank you very much to the RAF and to the Air Force from New Zealand for their assistance, the logistics on the ground, the sharing of intelligence and the way in which they work together would make all Australians proud. But this is a very difficult situation, Mr Speaker. We do have credible threats and intelligence in relation to planned terrorist attacks at the airport in that vicinity, and there has been advice issued by the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand and ourselves that people should not gather at the gates at the airport, that they should move immediately from that area and that they shouldn't be in areas of large gatherings. And that's the very clear advice to all of those people. And Mr Speaker, the focus for Australia now is to make sure that we can provide support to those people that we have based in AMAB, in the base that we have in the United Arab Emirates, where people are staging before they come to Australia to settle and to start a new life that once they could never have dreamed of. And the fact that we have, through the Australian Defence Force, the work of DFAT, of Home Affairs and others being able to provide that opportunity is a great credit to our country and many others, including those that I've spoken of in my answer today. I do want to thank again the Special Forces, the commandos, those that have been deployed from Laverack Barracks out of Townsville, and the SAS. Our country is incredibly well served and has been for many, many decades by the regiment, and the work that they do in keeping Australians safe and the heroics that have been displayed by all of our personnel in Kabul is quite remarkable, and has resulted in, frankly, a much better situation and outcome than we could have envisaged, always with more to do, but thank them and thank their families for the sacrifice of having the uncertainty of their loved ones being away at this very difficult time.
The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Join briefly with the Minister in paying tribute to all our servicemen and women and wish them a safe return.
The Chief Opposition Whip.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why are ambulances being forced to wait with COVID patients for hours on end parked outside Sydney hospitals because these hospitals are being overwhelmed? What responsibility does the Prime Minister take for leaving our hospital system unprepared 18 months into this pandemic?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I respectfully note to the member that there are challenges around the world. As we know, now over 700,000 cases in the last 24 hours, 14,500 lives lost. The global pandemic was something that, as the Prime Minister noted, we acted on early and began to prepare for our hospitals at the earliest time. In particular, not only did we declare this to be a disease of pandemic potential on the 21st of January 2020, we began the work to prepare both our public and our private hospital system from the outset. That included the acquisition of ventilators, that included the acquisition of masks, gloves, gowns. We've already acquired 500 million masks. We've made 94 million of those available through the National Medical Stockpile. In terms of the ventilators, 7,500 capacity around the country. New South Wales is over 2,000 ventilator capacity. In particular, though, the thing which we thought was fundamentally important was to create a national partnership to support our hospitals. That national partnership was, I believe, almost unique in Australian history, and I'm not aware of anything quite comparable around the world, although there have been some very good partnerships with regards to public and private hospitals. The Private Hospitals Viability Guarantee is designed to create a partnership where over 57,000 nurses, over 100,000 staff are available in times of surge. That has now been invoked in New South Wales. That was created to assist in precisely this moment. For this moment, planned,
Franklin.
prepared and now enacted. As the Prime Minister said, the first 19 hospitals from the private sector have already been included within it. It was enacted at earlier times last year. It's been re-invoked now. Those 19 hospitals have so far been tasked by New South Wales Health to provide 300 nurses, but beds, ventilators, staff are all available under that guarantee. Additional hospitals are also available. So not only was it foreseen, but the plans and preparations were put in place. It was used during the course of last year. It provides a surge capacity for any aged care residents which also need additional support outside of an acute care setting. And then, ultimately, it provides nurses, staff, beds, ventilators to assist any public health system anywhere in Australia at any moment where they may have a crisis because of COVID.
And I call the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's continuing assistance to help resettle Afghan nationals? And can the Minister outline how the government also continues to ensure the security of our borders?
The Minister for Home Affairs. The member for Bruce will leave the chamber under 94A.
He has to withdraw.
The member for I'll come back to that after question time. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Now, while the situation in Afghanistan remains unpredictable and dangerous, our work continues, not just in Kabul, but it remains around-the-clock efforts here in Australia to support all of those people that are working day and night to assist with the evacuation of people from Afghanistan. Now, overnight, we have airlifted about 1,200 people from Kabul, bringing to the total of about 4,000 people that we have assisted to evacuate from Kabul. Now, this has been, without a doubt, the largest humanitarian airlift operation in our history. It's an urgent and a dangerous mission, and it's one that has been conducted, that is being carried out under the most challenging of circumstances. And I do want to thank those people who have worked so hard in such challenging circumstances to do all they can to bring people out of a most desperate situation. Now, the government is doing everything it can to remain focused on facilitating further departures from Afghanistan of people who wish to leave, including under our humanitarian program. Now, we have already allocated 3,000 places to Afghan nationals to come here under our humanitarian program. That is a floor, not a ceiling. And we will be doing everything we can to support minorities, to support women and children, to support those people who have links to Australia, to support those people who have shown a commitment to Australia. And those people can be assured that we are doing absolutely every single thing that we can do to support them. Now, of course, let me say this, the integrity of our migration process and our borders is absolutely essential for community safety and confidence. And our Australian Border Force officials have been working very hard on the ground, conducting the security checks that are needed. And those checks are being undertaken because we have a responsibility as a government to make sure that we are keeping Australians safe and secure. And we will continue to make sure that all the appropriate checks are done on all of these people that we are bringing here to support Australia. I think that it's fair to say that this government has demonstrated over many, many years how seriously we take border security, and I do thank all of the people who have supported the government and who continue to work to make sure that we keep our borders safe and secure.
And I call the member for Perth.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister confirmed that a week after announcing an MOU with the West Australian Government to build a quarantine facility at Jandakot Airport, and a day after asking Parliament to authorise the works, that facility has now been canned in favour of a new site which is highly contaminated with PFAS. 18 months into a pandemic, isn't this a farce?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I note that the Bullsbrook quarantine site is also supported by the Western Australian Government, Mr Speaker, in forming that MOU to develop the facility on that site. And prior to selecting the site at Bullsbrook, an independent feasibility study from engineering and design firm AECOM was undertaken, finding the site was safe and suitable, and the site is approximately 3 kilometres from the operational Pearce RAF base.
And I call the member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on how GPs and pharmacies across the country are contributing to the record number of vaccinations being administered every day, like Dr Magda Campbell from MC Family Medical Practice in my electorate of Barara?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Barara for not just his question, but for his passion for mental health and suicide prevention and his focus on his community during this very challenging time. As I mentioned earlier, this pandemic continues to rage around the world with over 700,000 cases in the last 24 hours and 14,500 lives lost. So those figures remind us of the global challenge. Against that background, Australians have been stepping forward. 335,000 vaccinations in the last 24 hours, a rate which means that we are now vaccinating on a higher 7-day rolling average than at any time in the US or the UK rollouts. And at the heart of that have been our GPs and our pharmacists. Our primary care deliverers are approaching 10 million vaccinations, the lion's share of now over 18 million vaccinations. And they've worked in difficult circumstances, and they've changed their hours, and they've opened their practices, and they have helped save lives and protect lives on a grand scale. And they did this through all of the phases. Our pharmacies and our GPs, all of those people employed in their work have been absolute heroes. What we see now is 55.2% of eligible Australians have had a first vaccination, and the majority of these have done it through our primary care networks. Magda Campbell, the founder of the MC General Practice, has been in business, I believe, for over 35 years, and as a consequence of that, she's been passionate about supporting her community. Over 2,300 vaccines delivered through this one practice alone. Equally, the Terry White Pharmacy in Hornsby has stepped up recently and ended the program and delivered over 250 vaccines already. But they are emblematic of over 5,200 general practices and over 2,500 pharmacies, growing by the end of this week to 2,900 pharmacies. All of these practitioners are committed to supporting Australians. What we've seen is healthcare workers who have helped deliver over 6.7 million vaccines, well, as part of the 6.7 million vaccines in the last 30 days. Melbourne, Adelaide, Wollongong, the full populations of those, all done in the last 30 days. Our GPs and our pharmacists have been at the heart of it. We thank them, we honour them.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When will all 12 to 15-year-olds in Australia be fully vaccinated, and will the Prime Minister commit to including them in the 70% and 80% thresholds?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I've already foreshadowed, 12 to 15-year-olds in Australia will be vaccinated. The plan for the vaccination of 12 to 15s will be addressed by the National Security Committee on COVID this afternoon. At that meeting, we expect to receive the final advice from ATAGI that is necessary to enable that process to commence. General Fruin has been preparing that plan in anticipation of that, Mr Speaker, and we'll make further announcements after that process has been completed. The National Cabinet is meeting tomorrow. I'll have the opportunity to inform them of those arrangements, and they will, of course, have an important involvement in that process. Those 12 to 15-year-olds, the Doherty Institute, which has provided the scientific modelling that has formed the basis of the national plan, has made it very clear that they have not considered it necessary to include 12 to 15s in the overall vaccination targets, Mr Speaker, but that does not mean that they shouldn't be vaccinated. Of course they should be vaccinated, Mr Speaker, and the government will ensure that they are vaccinated. That is very important, Mr Speaker. I have two daughters, aged 12 and 14, and I think it's very important they become vaccinated, and they will be. And there are 1.2 million those in 12 to 15, Mr Speaker, who will need to be vaccinated in that cohort. And as I've already mentioned today in question time, 1.9 million vaccine doses were administered in just 1 week. And so it is entirely possible. And I note the interjection coming from the member for Ballarat, Mr Speaker. The answer to her question is contained in the advice provided by the government by the Doherty Institute. Now, if she wants to take issue with that advice, Mr Speaker, then she can. But we are going to continue to act consistent with that advice, because we believe that advice has been incredibly helpful in framing that national plan. So I want to make it very clear to the parents of Australia, Mr Speaker, that the government will be ensuring that we are vaccinating children aged 12 to 15, consistent with the very clear medical advice that we will be receiving, and we will be doing that as an important priority together with the vaccination of the broader population. But the Minister for Health may wish to add in the very little time remaining.
The Minister for Health, the member for
Thank you very
Ballarat's
much.
now
To address the issue directly, as responded to by Professor Sharon Lewin, the head of the Doherty Institute, in her interview on the 23rd of August, only a few days ago, her quote, unquote, "The additional benefit of 12 to 15-year-olds is not great in reducing transmission. We know that in 12 to 15-year-olds. COVID is a nasty illness and we don't want children to get it, that very few children end up with severe disease or in hospital. That doesn't mean that 12 to 15-year-olds shouldn't be vaccinated. Yes, they should. Will they make a big difference to the modelling opening up the plan? They don't make a big difference." That was in response to the exact question posed by the opposition. That's why they have provided the advice to the government that the correct national cohort is 16+.
The member for Ballarat has been warned. She's been asked to cease interjecting about 10 times. Do you want to walk or? Yeah, I am. Yep. You can leave under 94 road. Give the call to the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Securing our energy supply will provide certainty for businesses and households across Australia, including in my electorate of Lindsay. Will the Minister please update the House on how sticking to the national plan helps continue the important work the Morrison government is doing to ensure that all Australians have access to the affordable and reliable energy?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question and thank her for her relentless advocacy for manufacturing in Western and south-western Sydney. She knows that the 900,000 Australians who work in manufacturing, many of whom are in Western and south-western Sydney, they rely on having access to affordable, reliable energy for their jobs, Mr Speaker, and that's why the Morrison government is taking the lead alongside the states and territories and alongside the Energy Security Board to make sure we have an electricity grid that is fit for the future, Mr Speaker. Now, as the member knows, we are seeing record levels of investment in renewables in this country. 7 gigawatts last year alone, 6.3 the year before that. 7 gigawatts constitutes more than 4 large coal-fired power stations in a single year, Mr Speaker. We have the highest uptake of rooftop solar in the world, Mr Speaker. 1 in 4 houses in Australia, 8,500 houses and businesses in the member for Lindsay's electorate. And this investment in renewables is bringing down emissions fast, but it is also creating challenges, Mr Speaker, because our manufacturers, our households and small businesses need to know when they flick the switch, when the sun has gone down, that the lights will still go on, Mr Speaker. And sadly, in recent years, we haven't seen the investment in dispatchable capacity that we need, Mr Speaker. Indeed, it's been 12 years since there's been an investment in dispatchable capacity in New South Wales, and we've seen what happens when there isn't enough investment in dispatchable capacity or there's a premature closure. In Victoria, when Hazelwood closed, and overnight we saw more than doubling of wholesale electricity prices, Mr Speaker. Well, we can't see a repeat of that, and that's why the reforms to the national electricity market put forward by the ESB are an opportunity to ensure that Australia's electricity system is fit for the future. It will ensure that we have enough dispatchable capacity alongside those record investments in renewables, investment in generation like gas, pumped hydro, batteries, coming into the market at the right time, Mr Speaker. Now, a critical element of the full recommendations is a capacity mechanism, and energy markets around the world, the large proportion of them use capacity mechanisms, Mr Speaker, and that's why we've seen strong support and welcoming of these recommendations from companies like EDL, ENGIE, Australian Energy Council and many other experienced players in the industry. Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we are absolutely committed to the affordable, reliable energy all Australians need, and particularly those 900,000 Australians who work in manufacturing.
The member for Franklin.
My question is to the Minister for Health. The Health Minister said the Morrison-Joyce government's COVID Safe app has not been used to identify a single contact during the Sydney outbreak. Would half of Australia be in lockdown if the government had an app that worked and hadn't wasted millions of dollars on an app that doesn't?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. No, I don't accept the proposition of that question at all. Very significantly, what we know in relation to the app is that it played a very important part in identifying in New South Wales at this stage, as at across Australia, as at 18 August 2021, 792 COVID-safe users who have tested positive for COVID-19, resulted in more than 1.65 million digital handshakes being uploaded to the data store. 2,829 potential close contacts have been identified, and in addition, New South Wales has successfully accessed the app to identify around 81 close contacts, including 17 contacts that were not identified by manual contact tracing. As we know, any single case can lead to many others, so it's played an important role.
The member for Braddon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Australia's defence industry is a significant and important contributor to our economy and helps create thousands of jobs across the country, including jobs for our veterans. Will the Minister inform the House how sticking to the national plan will continue the Morrison government's efforts to support Australian jobs in defence industry? Thank you, Minister.
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Braddon for his question and acknowledge his service to the nation, and also acknowledge just what a terrific advocate he is for defence industry in Braddon, but also across the whole of Tasmania. Mr Speaker, repeated lockdowns and border closures have placed massive challenges on businesses across Australia, including our defence industry businesses. Defence industry relies upon the movement across states and territories of essential equipment and supplies, and also expert personnel to ensure that we build up our defence capabilities to keep Australians safe. And over the last 18 months, my priority has to ensure that we've kept the wheels of defence industry turning. Mr Speaker, from the latest data that we have, Defence's annual spend on capability has contributed more than $29 billion to the broader national economy, with our defence spending supporting over 100,000 jobs right across the country in multiple industries. Mr Speaker, it is not just the defence industry that gets this impact, and it has flow-on effect by enabling businesses to grow and to be able to expand their services and also to employ more Australians. And the key, Mr Speaker, to the building on this success is the National Plan, announced by the Prime Minister and endorsed by the National Cabinet. The National Plan does provide that pathway, that brighter times for businesses and families across the nation. And it is a tremendous confidence booster for defence industry. It tells those thousands of companies, those small manufacturing companies across the suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney, and also those giant naval operations in South Australia and Western Australia, that Australia is ready to go. Companies can now start to have hope for the future. They can now start to think about, am I going to take on another couple of employees? They're going to start to dust off that expansion plan. They're going to start to think about, shall I put my hand up for that next defence industry contract? And at the heart of the National Plan, Mr Speaker, is our drive to accelerate and roll out our vaccinations right across the country. Mr Speaker, honestly, we would all agree that Australians have been quite remarkable, rolling up their sleeve and just being determined to do their bit. And I say well done to Australians. To West Australians, I say, let's show a little bit more of that Sandgroper competitive spirit, and please roll up your sleeve a little bit quicker. We currently sit them at the bottom of the league ladder, and that is not good enough. Mr Speaker, today I released a terrific video highlighting the many great naval shipbuilding jobs that are available in Western Australia right now, which are made possible by our government's record investment in shipbuilding. Mr Speaker, the theme is work where you live, so I encourage anybody who's listening to please think about joining such an exciting industry called our naval shipbuilding industry.
The member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. On the 24th of June, the Minister told the House having no Australian in ICU due to COVID was a real measure of the government's success. Today, there are more than 120 COVID patients in 3 states in ICU. Isn't that tragic figure a measure of the Morrison-Joyce government's failure?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And to the member, there are in fact 131 Australians in ICU, and each one of those lives is fundamentally important, and each is a life for which we fight. We know, as I've said earlier in question time, that the global pandemic has reached over 700,000 cases and taken 14,500 lives in 24 hours alone. It's approaching 4.5 million lives officially around the world, and as the World Health Organization has said, the real figure is probably between 2 to 3 times that. So we're not untouched. We're not immune from a global pandemic that sees our great friend and neighbour New Zealand in a nationwide lockdown right at this moment. But what we have done as a nation is save over 30,000 lives on an average comparison with the OECD and the tragedy and the lives that they have lost on a per capita basis. That figure is 45,000 lives saved in this country when we look at it by comparison with our other great friends, the United States and the United Kingdom. And so we see that so many nations have suffered so badly. We're not immune, but what we have done as a nation is to ensure that we have saved lives on a grand scale. But every day, in a pandemic which has raged around the world, which has ravaged communities, we have to be aware that this is now a pandemic which has become endemic. It means that it has embedded itself globally on all the advice we have from epidemiologists around the world. What that means is we have to have all of our rings of containment: borders, testing, tracing, distancing and vaccination. To see vaccination rates in the last 24 hours at 335,000, to see over 18 million vaccinations, to see a figure amongst our elderly of over 86%, 86.2% for our over 70s and 88.4% in our residential aged care facilities, is to see protection in action, to see these things which have saved lives and protected lives. And so all of these elements come together to ensure that we have a response which has saved, as the Prime Minister has so often said, over 30,000 lives by comparison with our OECD partners and the tragedy that they've faced. It's an ongoing task for the globe, and I think we have to be honest that this is a global pandemic that has become endemic, that has embedded itself around the globe, but will continue to fight to save every single life.
And I call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison government is sticking to the national plan and protecting Australians during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly through support for children learning from home?
The Minister for Communications.
Well, I do thank the member for Reid, who of course brings distinguished academic and professional experience to this matter as a highly qualified psychologist, but also as a mother of several children studying at home I know seeing my own 12-year-old son studying at home, and I know many of us in this chamber have children studying at home and around Australia, millions of children. And we are also proud of our children for the way they're dealing with this challenging time, but it is challenging. Just last week I had the chance to speak to two groups of classes by Zoom at St Ives High School and Barker College in my electorate, seeing them get on with their education, but we all want to get through to a point where education can return to more normal modes of operation. But in the meantime, that internet connectivity is so important, and what's also so important is that we are protecting the safety of children online, because there are dangers online and we need to guard against them. That's why our government has had a focus since coming to government in 2013 on online safety. We established the world's first e-safety commissioner. We established a cyberbullying scheme to remove harmful bullying content from social media platforms. When an Australian child is bullied online, the e-safety commissioner is there to help, esafety.gov.au. Trusted e-safety providers endorsed by the e-safety commissioner are delivering education programs in Australian schools, 850 sessions to over 120,000 students just in 3 months last year. And of course, we're not stopping there, having just taken through the parliament our tough new Online Safety Act to keep children and other Australians safe online. So, Mr Speaker, keeping children safe online when they're studying is so important, but of course what's also critical when you're learning or working from home is having a good broadband connection. If we had stuck with Labor's plan, which we inherited when we came to government in 2013, up to 5 million fewer premises would be connected to the NBN today. Labor's failed NBN had barely 50,000 premises connected to the fixed-line network when we came to government. We've got on with getting that NBN rolled out, which is so important to allowing children to study from home, and today 8.26 million premises are connected. Labor barely managed to roll out 50,000 premises in the 6 years that they were in government, Mr Deputy Speaker. They did a hopeless job on the NBN rollout. Let's just be thankful they're not responsible for the vaccine rollout.
The member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister act on the constructive proposal Labor outlined in the 2020 budget reply and establish an Australian Centre for Disease Control so that Australia adopts international best practice and is much better prepared for future pandemics?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I note that the member has put forward the American model and the European model. Correct?
And the opposition.
The results in those countries through the course of this pandemic, and I think this is a very important moment to reflect, have been vastly different to that which occurred in Australia. In the United States, we have seen over 600,000 lives lost. In the UK, we have seen over 125,000 lives lost. In the UK, we are seeing tragically and agonisingly over almost 100 lives lost a day at this point in time. And in the United States, almost 130,000 cases a day. And so we respect their approaches, but we have followed the Australian way, and the Australian way has saved lives and protected lives. Compared with those two nations, which have the model which the Leader of the Opposition has advocated, we have saved 45,000 lives. 45,000 Australians are with us today who, if we had taken the approach in those other countries, would not be here. And so, do we believe that the Australian system has served Australia well? Yes. Every day are we working through the National Cabinet, are we working through the AHPPC? Are we working through the Scientific and Technical Advisory Group? Are we working through ATAGI, the Therapeutic Goods Administration? We are. But the models upon which the ALP is basing its approach for Australia are models which most agonisingly have led to or been part of a process which contributed to catastrophic loss of life, not in the thousands, not in the tens of thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands. No, the point is that those structures did not protect those societies. What we did is we embedded the Chief Medical Officer of Australia inside the National Security Committee, inside the National Cabinet, and the National Incident Centre, which radiates out from that, created an Australian model which led to results which are profoundly different. And so I have to remind the opposition that in the end, in this global pandemic, we have had struggles and challenges, and we are not untouched. But this pandemic has wreaked havoc on a scale we have not seen in 100 years, and we have been mercifully spared from so much of that, but there is much more to do.
Call the member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Health. Will the minister update the House on the progress the Morrison-Joyce government is making in rolling out the COVID-19 vaccines to regional, rural and remote Australians, and in particular the effects of the Royal Flying Doctor Service? Thank you.
The Minister for Regional Health.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd first of all like to thank the member for Flynn for his question and compliment him on the amazing service he's delivered to the good people of Flynn over his career in Parliament. 11 years. Congratulations. As you know, in his own hometown in Gladstone, there are 7 different sites, community-based sites, that he can get a vaccine at, and his people can. But out in the far west and in other rural and regional and remote seats nearby in Queensland, they would have to depend on the Royal Flying Doctor Service to deliver not only the technology but the vaccine service, and they've been doing a sterling job. In the good member for Leichhardt's electorate, just in the last 3 weeks, 1,400 people have received a vaccine in some of the more remote Indigenous shires. Places like Cowan and Lockhart River and Pomperow, Kowanyama. In the northwest, the Flying Doctor Service turned up to vaccinate many more, and there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy. They brought mental health staff with them, and they had sausage sizzles, educated people and addressed their concerns, and they've gone ahead in leaps and bounds. They've been around the state, Ravenswood, Birdsville, Mount Surprise, you name it, all these remote places are on the plan for the Flying Doctor Service. In the Northern Territory, they're ramping up now to deliver 15,000 vaccines across 172 clinic sites. Now, everyone knows about the situation in the northwest of New South Wales. The good member for Parkes has been at the forefront there, realises how important the Flying Doctor Service is. They're based in Broken Hill, where they have been not only delivering vaccines, they've brought another 8,000 vaccines into the northwest of the state. They have been involved in actually vaccinating themselves, 3,048 people in the last couple of weeks. They flew in advanced teams because they go by road as well as by air. They deliver medical services, dental services, health services, but they've stepped up to the mark and are delivering vaccines in the most far-flung places of Australia. This big, wide, brown land is covered by the Flying Doctor. That's why they have such an amazing rapport with everyone. Look, in Walgett, Wilcannia, Bourke, all these places where the outbreak is, they've been involved in all of those, whether it's the point-of-care testing that they've delivered extra shots to Broken Hill or to Bourke and Walgett, and in Armatree, they had 40 people booked to turn up, and when they knew it was the Flying Doctor, 198. So, grey nomads, you'll be able to get back out into Western New South Wales. People in Western New South Wales know that the Flying Doctor has your back and you can resume your normal way of life.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Just 18% of First Nations Australians are fully vaccinated. Just half of aged care workers are fully vaccinated. Just 28% of NDIS participants are fully vaccinated, and less than half of the disability workforce are fully vaccinated. 18 months into this pandemic, why are so many vulnerable Australians so at risk, particularly given the Prime Minister said so many of these groups would be fully vaccinated by Easter?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 335,000 doses of the vaccine were administered yesterday. That was a record for this vaccination program in Australia, and that included the groups that the member has referred to in his question. Those groups again which he's referred to, and others, Mr Speaker: aged care residents, 88.6% on their first dose, second dose 84.1%. Aged care workers, 76.9% on their first dose, 54.5% on their second dose, Mr Speaker. And disability care residents, Mr Speaker, 68.4% on their first dose and 53.8% on their second. Disability care workers now also over 50%, 58% on their first dose, 39.1% on their second dose. And importantly, Mr Speaker, those who are over 70, the most vulnerable in our population, Mr Speaker, some 86.2% of them now vaccinated on their first dose, and just shy of 60%, 59.9%, Mr Speaker, on their second dose. The vaccination program in Australia this past week, 1.9 million doses in the course of the week. That, on a per capita basis, is stronger than anything we saw in the United Kingdom or the United States and France and other places, Mr Speaker, on their best week. On their best week, Mr Speaker, and we know that that vaccination program will continue to move forward in the months ahead and move into those communities where the vaccination rates are still below where they need to be, Mr Speaker, but the program will ensure that they do reach those programs, and it's up to every single member of this House, Mr Speaker, to ensure we're doing every single thing we can to promote that vaccination program in their communities, to create confidence in that program so people will come forward and they'll access that program. In states where they're lagging, Mr Speaker, to encourage them to go and get vaccinated. And in many of those states, that is often because the level of COVID has been so low, and particularly, I'd say, in Indigenous communities where the Minister for Indigenous Australians have been doing such great work, and to encourage them, because when they've seen COVID start to come into their communities, they have become aware that simply by being remote does not make you immune. And when we have seen that occur, then we have seen those vaccination rates rise. Mr Speaker, that vaccination program and its success and its rate of vaccination, as we are seeing now, will see, I believe, based on the rates we're achieving now, the 70% and 80% rates under the national plan are very achievable. They are achievable this year, Mr Speaker, and that gives Australians hope. That gives Australians great hope that the national plan, the SAFE plan, Mr Speaker, the Australian plan being done the Australian way to give Australians hope for their future, that is rolling out across the country. I want to thank the government members for their great support of that plan and promoting it throughout the country, and I encourage all members to do the same.
Time has concluded, and I call the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Will the Minister please update the House on the progress of the COVID-19 vaccination rollout in remote Indigenous communities and the importance of working in partnership with community leaders to counter misinformation online and ensure high vaccination take-up?
The Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby and for her strong leadership in this House. I'll share with you the number of first doses now that Indigenous Australians have received are over 200,000 or 34%. 108,000 have received their second dose at 18%, but the most interesting one is those with the unknown address. 5,707 have come in to have a vaccination, and 2,699 have also joined that process. One of the challenges that we're still having is the misinformation that is online. Even when we speak in this chamber in some of our speeches, our people listen to what is said. I had one who asked me, was there a shortage of vaccinations and doses? That was because that heard one comment. So we have to ensure that we stand with our Indigenous leaders to make sure that the work they're doing, and they're working their backsides off to get people into clinics, into vaccination points, into GPs, into the ADF, into the AUSMAT teams, and with the RFDS. And where there are shortages, if there is one at all, like the member for Newcastle, who I'll compliment, raised with me an issue this morning, and I'll follow those through. It is better that you talk to us so that we can deal with these matters. Even with Wilcannia, there was messages saying there were food shortages. What's interesting in the Wilcannia news is this: a coordinated effort between the Local Emergency Management Committee, Aboriginal Affairs, Murray-Mar, Red IE and Central Darling Shire Council will see food deliveries to households in Wilcannia on Saturday. 566 food hampers were distributed, with 173 personal hygiene hampers going out. So what we're doing is we are coordinating through leadership at the regional level, the level of engagement to ensure that people have the vaccinations. Our vulnerable community has had support, and I will compliment all members in this chamber, because there are many on the other side who have gone out and talked with Aboriginal organisations and supported them. We need to continue to make sure that our efforts are parallel with Indigenous media. What we do know is our people listen more to Indigenous media than they do to mainstream, because that's where they get the cultural messages, they get messages in language, and they get it in plain speak, which gives them the assuredness that what's being offered is there and it's real. So I would ask all of us in our electorates to talk to Aboriginal organisations to see what support they need and provide that level of support.
The time has concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister. Just before people depart, when I ejected the member for Bruce Understanding Order 94A, his behaviour on leaving was completely unacceptable. I won't repeat everything he did, other than to say that when members are asked to leave under 94A, they need to do so immediately, without comment or abuse to anybody. And I said at the time I would deal with that at the end of question time, and a number of matters I weighed very quickly on that. I'm not going to wait for the member for Bruce to finish his 1 hour and come back to the House. The course of action I'm taking, I'm making very clear, is I'm going to name the member for Bruce now, and that the matter will be dealt with one way or the other by the House, and then we can get on with the business of the day. I name the member for Bruce, the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move the member be suspended from the service of the House.
Question is the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Gray and Flynn tell us for the ayes, and the honourable members for Werriwa and MacArthur tell us for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 25, noes 14. The question is therefore resolved in the affirmative. I present the annual report of the Australian... Oh, sorry, we've just got a bit to go, can I? Sorry, after all that I do need to do the important thing. With the result being in the affirmative, the member for Bruce is suspended from the service of the House for 24 hours. I present the annual report of the Australian National Audit Office for 2020-2021, and we're about to move immediately to the matter of public importance. I've received a letter from the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the impact of the government always acting too little too late. I call upon those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places, and I call the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Well, Oscar Wilde once noted, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you place the blame.